Hello, Future Martin here. I do apologise. In the first few minutes of this video that we recorded live on Twitch, the music is a bit loud. If you can get through the first few minutes, I realise my mistake and the music volume is corrected and the majority of the interview is perfectly audible. So apologies, we'll do better in the future. Enjoy the interview. With the housekeeping out of the way, I think it's time to introduce our guests. So I'm delighted to welcome Jillian and Jono. Hello, both of you. How are you?
Hello, everyone.
Great.
Doing wonderful.
Excellent.
Yeah, doing great. Thanks for having me
Now,
on.
for those of you that haven't met either of you before, Jillian, could you just briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jillian Hufnagel. I am currently a member of Team Slim. I am head of culture and human capital. I am also a startup junkie. I've been in startups for 20 years, anywhere from cybersecurity to tech ed to now, obviously, the DevOps space. And I'm just happy to be here.
Thank you. And Jono.
Hey everyone, thrilled to be here. So my background is in building communities. I've been doing it my whole career at this point. I'm very uninterested in this job. Used to lead community for Ubuntu, also at GitHub Nextprize. And these days I'm a consultant and work with lots of different companies on how to build amazing communities.
Thanks very much. Now, we're here today because, Jillian, you've got a talk coming up, right?
Yeah, we're really excited. We're going to be in the diversity, equity, and inclusion thread at the Open Source Summit. It's the Linux Embed and Open Source Summit coming up. I'll be speaking on September 29th, and I'm sure there's a lot of other content in there that would be really exciting and relevant to our listeners. So it should be fun. Whether you join us virtually or in person, we would love to see you.
Yes. Now, I see that Monica, who's in the chat, says she'll see you there. I think
Yay.
that's on the proviso that you're going to be there in person. We don't quite know that yet, I don't think. But providing you are, then Monica, yes, you can introduce yourself to Jill. I'm sure you'll have plenty to talk about. Now, this conversation today is kind of, before I joined Slim, I listened to the two of you on Jono's podcast. So I think this is also sort of essential listening. After you've watched this, you probably want to go back. So jonobacon.com and you'll find Jono's podcast where they dig into this topic as well. So where do we start with this? I think we're using using this as a teaser to sort of, touch on some of the topics that you want to discuss in your upcoming talk. That's right, isn't it, Jillian?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. It's a bridge from mine and Jono's prior conversation around just being an authentic human in the workplace and talking about being values and mission aligned as a team. And then also really diving deep into what are some of the things that work and don't work in open source communities and how do you bring them into an organization? So how do you bridge the gap between I have a bunch of users who love what we're doing, who are contributing, who are thriving in an open source community, and then there are parts and pieces of that you can kind of lift and shift over into an organization, and then there are pieces and parts of it that you really can't. And I would love for us today to talk about what each of us have learned, not just Jono and myself, but Martin, yourself as well. What have we learned about, how do you architect a team that looks and behaves like your diverse users? How do you remain authentic to the commitment and the mission that you have in your open source and bridge that into your SaaS or your organization? And then also, how do you weave contribution and empathy through all of those things? So I hope we get to dive a little bit deep on, some of the prickly parts of community and culture and really help our listeners navigate that.
Okay, then. So you talk about authenticity there. That could mean different things to different people. So what do you mean when you're talking about authenticity in the context of, teams and team culture and community building?
I think for me, from a culture perspective, is you always want to show up as your authentic self as long as you're aligned with the mission. So those things have to be cohesive. I can go be my authentic self in a lot of different environments, but if I am not fully bought into and passionate about the mission of what the organization is contributing into the world, therein by I cannot be authentic. So those things really have to be married. I deeply believe in what we're doing at Slim to support developers to remove friction and waste as they are building their cloud-based applications and deploying them into the world, right? I believe that we are responsible for making that easier and better for them.
Mhm.
If I didn't believe that, I couldn't be my full authentic self at Slim.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I would just kind of layer on top of what Jillian's saying as well, is that to me, if we look at it from a business or a technology perspective, all technology is in service of solving a problem or adding some kind of value. And businesses are entities that are there to create products and services that will generate value for their customers and users. And what I find fascinating about the business world and in parts of the tech world is that somehow all of that gets infected with certain people who want to project a different image than the reality of what's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've all sat in meetings with people who they keep their own personal perspectives to one side because of fear of looking silly, looking different, losing their job, being excluded in some capacity. And when we did that podcast, when I first met Jillian, it's interesting. You meet certain people and you just immediately hit it off. And I knew I wanted to have her come on my podcast. And part of the reason for that is because there was such an intrinsic focus on breaking down all of that nonsense. But I think we'd all acknowledge that it's difficult, especially like if you're younger in your career, or if you're a new developer, for example, and you join a company as an engineer, sometimes it's really hard to be yourself. But I think the more we get absolute purity between what your audience wants and how you go about producing it, then you don't just get better results. You just get a place where people actually want to hang out and work. And I think that's the thing that's critical.
Yeah, and we have some examples of where our sort of commitment to culture and authenticity has actually helped us tap into a talent pool that feel the same way that we do. I think you've got an example of that, Jillian, where we've had, I think as a result of the podcast that you and Jono did, that was actually the first time they'd heard about Slim and were intrigued about the company based on the conversation you had.
Yeah, and I think, it's important to kind of peel back and see where this stems from, right? I'm not responsible for formulating our culture. Our co-founders are, right? And so when I look at how John and Kyle show up in the world and what they're trying to produce, Kyle being the creator of our open source and he and John being folks that have known and worked with each other for a long time, we're really taking the best of what they believe needs to be true to support developers, bringing it in marriage between the contribution and value that we have in our open source, and then creating synergy with our internal organization, right? And so as head of culture, I'm responsible for making sure that we have an environment where that can thrive. But it doesn't stem from me, right? Each one of us, and Martin, you know this to be true, each one of us has a ownership and essentially almost like an honor code where we have to live that way internal to our business all the time. And we also have to live that way external in our community. So when we're engaging with our users, we do it in a way where we are trustworthy, where we are responsive, where we are collaborative. And I think some of the things that start to break down, whether it's in business or open source, is how we respond to others in the workplace or in the community really defines whether or not that culture is healthy.
Indeed. I mean, you talk about their how we interact with our users, not just how we conduct ourselves internally. This was something that I put a great deal of effort into some years ago when I was creating a new community. I'd sort of seen, looking around the sort of specifically sort of the Linux space, there's sort of been this top-down inheritance of the way you communicate your engineering prowess and your leadership in projects was to be well, not very nice, actually quite confrontational, use poor language, denigrate people. Really, it was quite an unkind way of interacting with individuals. And so from the very beginning of that project, I thought, well, I don't want to create something where that is how people are behaving. So the route that I took was and at that time, all of the communication was very much text based on social networks and what have you. So I always went very, very carefully to make sure that the words that I'd written could not be misinterpreted as confrontational. And actually, emoji were extremely helpful in me actually sort of trying to convey the sentiment behind the words. Now, this community is the Ubuntu Mate community, some of whom are in the chat here this evening. And I think we've created a friendly place by that sort of my top-down, let's behave in a decent way. People see the way that I communicated and then emulate that within the community. And it's known as a nice place to be. It is well regarded in that respect.
There's a couple of things on that that I think are important to highlight. One is that, psychologically, we've seen this over and over again, that human beings mimic their leaders, right? Which is one of the reasons why if you get really kind of terrible, despotic regimes at the top of a company, especially on the next layer down, people feel like that's what you need to do to be successful. Mm-hmm. And you get the same effect when you have got really great people at the top of the business as well. But I think the other thing that you really underline there as well, Martin, is trying to extricate the emotion from a situation and to focus on intent and practical problem solving, right? Like every community, every business is going to have people who are just not going to get on very well. They're going to butt heads and all the rest of it. And I actually have a couple of examples to share here that are relevant. Many years ago, when I was at Canonical running the Ubuntu community team, there was an individual who shall be nameless, who was kind of, frankly, significantly disliked in the community because every time there was a conversation about anything, he'd jump in and he was critical and he'd complain and he just kind of moaned a lot. Sometimes there wasn't really a lot of actual content behind it. It was just basically whining. And the challenging situation here was that, while meritocracy is a great North Star, I think we all know that in many ways it's not actually real because everybody starts from a different position in any place and has different forces that are influencing how they participate. But he had a lot of merit and continues to today. Like he'd done a lot of engineering. People loved his work. They just didn't particularly like him and the way he engaged. And I reached out to him and said, hey, is there any chance we can have a chat? And I said to him, look, I'm talking to you now as a friend, not as the Ubuntu community manager, but you're getting perceived in this particular way. And I know you're a good guy and I know you've got great intentions, but this is how people are seeing you. And it was uncomfortable feedback to deliver. He was completely surprised. He had no idea he was coming across that way. He thought he was fighting the good fight and maintaining an objective project. And he had no idea that this aggregation of interactions was generating this perspective that people had with him. And to me, all too often what happens here is you get these, either people start kind of, either there's conflict or people are just not really on the same page. And there's an over-indexing of the words. There's an over-indexing of the actions. And there isn't often an over-indexing of the intent. And I think this is actually one of the things I find most disappointing about our culture as it stands today. And you see this all over social media, is that people will absolutely eviscerate people for a word or a set of words, but they won't look at the intent behind it. And to me, the healthiest communities, the healthiest businesses, the healthiest places are where you've got leaders who understand that we're imperfect as human beings, and try to find empathy as a means of not just destroying somebody, like the guy that I was talking about. I think many people would have liked to have just gone after him, but instead like saying, okay, let's just level set and explore how we can move forward in a way that's better for everybody. But the challenge with that is it's not satisfying to do that. It's really satisfying to eviscerate someone on Twitter, but it's not satisfying to sit down and have the difficult conversation. But I think that to me is at the genesis of really great cultures.
Right. So we are getting some questions coming in, and I'm making some notes here, and I'm going to try and weave these into our discussion. So Monica has just asked, off the point that you were making, Jono, she says, Jono, how do you deal with that situation when that person, quite frankly, doesn't care about how their abrasiveness affects others?
So the first question I would have is how much we know that they don't care. Now, I'll caveat this response with this. I am an eternal optimist. I generally see the good in people. There are fundamentally terrible people out there, but from my experience, the rest of us outnumber those people. I think there are very few people who literally don't care about them being abrasive. What they may have is a different viewpoint on what is the most effective way to solve the problem. Some people kind of have the school of hard knocks approach, which is like, okay, I'm just going to shout my way forward. So the first thing I would do is to evaluate, evaluate as accurately as possible that aspect of things. The thing that I would recommend next then is to present this feedback in a way that is supportive, is to say, look, hey, I just want to share this with you. I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to change you. But the way I like to say it is, again, I'm here as a friend, and I don't think you'd want to be perceived this way, and I think we can do more if we can find a solution to this. And I've literally never had a situation where somebody has rejected that approach. Often they've challenged the feedback and they've been defensive with the feedback, but they've never pushed away on it. And then to me, the important thing there then is naturally when people get that kind of uncomfortable, embarrassing feedback, they become defensive and their ego takes over. And what I always like to do is to say, okay, I completely understand why you feel this way. I know this is upsetting, but let's focus on what we can do. Let's focus on a practical thing that we can do that will rectify the situation, and give them the confidence that, we can fix this. Like, this is totally fixable. That's how I would like to approach it. If after multiple attempts of doing this, somebody is completely resistant, they're unwilling to listen to people, then they are one of that small toxic minority of people. And at that point, moderation, frankly, is the path forward.
Right. Tailing off what you were saying, Andy Hazen asks this, Jillian. How do you say no? This doesn't follow our goals for the project to the community without creating a toxic culture?
I actually think no is not a negative word. I think no is a really healthy word that we stopped using because we trade what we believe is being nice and being kind. I think it's totally appropriate to set a healthy boundary with someone and say, whether you have a code of conduct within your community or not, you may have rules that are, maybe they're not written down, maybe they're not an artifact, but they have become part of how you behave. Maybe this is time to start writing them down. Maybe this is time to codify them and say, this is our user code of conduct within this particular community, because sometimes people don't actually really know what the guardrails are if they haven't been defined. And sometimes people don't know that the guardrails even exist, depending on how you onboarded them into the project or the community. So I do like to have an artifact to go back to and say, let me show you where you should be, and then let me understand where you're at. And what Jono was saying is, like, I like to say, go meet someone where they're at. So I would try to go meet that person where they're at and then help them understand how do they get to where they need to be in order to not get into that no category, right? I think that we all also step forward at different paces. and with different levels of vigor. So sometimes someone might not be ready now to step forward. And so you may say, if you don't have an appetite to step forward into what's appropriate in terms of creating healthy contribution and healthy dialogue and seeking to understand your peers, we're gonna give you a little timeout. And we're gonna be here when you're ready to come back. Because we do believe that you can contribute and we do believe that you add value. Everyone adds value. The how matters. And so I think that goes back to Martin. What you were saying is when you were observing behavior in this other community that you knew was misaligned from like where you start as a human, you chose to model different behavior. And as Jono said before, we're all humans and we're fallible, we're imperfect, and we're not always working with a full foundation. You know, we're not always our best selves. So I wouldn't consider it a no. I would consider it a let me give you an opportunity to walk forward with me, and I will be here to help you do that. If you're incapable of doing it, we're going to find a healthy way to give you a pause.
Right.
And that happens in the workplace too, right? That's not just in your community. Like if you have a team member or a peer or even a leader who is really not showing up their best self, you can take that opportunity to say, can I meet you where you're at? Can I seek to understand what your challenge is? And then can we both agree what the good outcome would look like?
Yeah.
And that takes time. It takes effort. It takes care. And oftentimes we're moving really fast. So we have to train ourselves to slow down and take that opportunity.
Yeah, you just said taking the time to understand, you know, where somebody is or what their thought process is. And I find that interesting because when you and I spoke, Jillian, I think it may have been while I was interviewing or very soon after I joined the company, we had a conversation and you said something along the lines about, you know, not being judgmental and looking to understand other people's positions, point of views, perspective before you jump to judgment. Now, I've always felt like I haven't been one to jump to judgment, but that particular exchange we had has really sort of stuck in my mind, and I'm far more conscious about being in a position to understand where other people are coming from before I think about judging their behavior or their actions or their conduct. And I think it's a very powerful, like, first skill to develop in terms of sort of, you know, developing your approach to interacting, not just with your colleagues, but with your community as well.
Yeah, and I think that intention is really... Oh, go ahead, Jono.
No, go ahead, Jillian.
I think that intention is really important, especially when you're working with folks in a community who are maybe younger in career or younger in experience. And so you may have a developer come into your open source community who is really seeking to learn and they just don't even know where to start. And they may ask a question that seems, frankly, silly or dumb. How you respond to that makes or breaks your community. How you respond to that makes or breaks that person's future. Because if you respond with empathy and kindness and a willingness to understand where they're at in their learning cycle, you can really create much better contribution into your community and, quite frankly, into your business.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something very similar, which is kind of going back to this notion of intent. I think it's, in my mind, the most important thing to evaluate is what is the intention of that person. I've seen countless examples over the years where really decent people have really made pretty silly choices. And I'd include myself in that list of people, right? Anyone who's woken up with a hangover, anybody who's thrown up in a bar, anybody who has said something stupid in a meeting, anybody who has broken up with somebody by text. Like, we've all made these kinds of silly choices. And I think the tricky thing where we are right now is because there's a bit of a mob mentality at times where if somebody does something that seemingly violates a key principle in an area, in a specific culture, whether it's a broader culture or whether it's in a specific project, it's easy for everybody to pile on. And there's a certain amount of virtue in kind of coming together to get the poison out of the system. And my worry about that is when nobody evaluates the intention, sometimes what's happening then is a relatively innocent mistake or a relatively innocent lack of judgment is perceived as poison, whereas it's actually a growth opportunity. There was a guy, this is another example from Ubuntu, a number of years ago, who no matter what he did in the project, he just seemed to put his foot in it constantly. And again, it was kind of rubbing some people up the wrong way. And then I actually ended up getting on a call with him. And the first thing I discovered is that he was 14 years old. The second thing that I discovered is he was, I forget exactly where it was. I think if I remember right, he was in Iraq. He was somewhere in the Middle East. And he'd never participated in the community like this before. So his combination of excitement and lack of interest meant that he was violating some quote unquote rules in the community or just some norms that he had no idea he was doing it. And then when we talked to him about it, he was completely fine and he made those changes. So I just think let's always look at the intent.
Yeah. And Boo Barry makes a point along a similar line. You know, you sought out this individual to find out that there was a cultural difference, you know, in where they were coming from. And Boo Barry makes the point it's also good to consider behaviours in the context of neurodiversity. Someone may appear not to care, but they just don't have a typical way of showing it. It's very difficult to handle this. And
I love that. I love that. That neurodiversity piece is something that is really more obvious as kind of our culture comes forward and how we work. And I think it's important for us to touch on the concept of diversity, especially when you're going from an open source and trying to build a startup at the same time. One of the things we talked about when we were getting ready for this call was this idea of, you know, the pressure that businesses feel today to make sure that they check every single diversity box, like right out of the gate. And I think that can be overwhelming when you're thinking about, I've got this super awesome open source project with this amazing community, and I want to make a business out of it. And then you're like, holy cow, like, look at all of these like equal opportunity employer rules in the United States. Look at like the diversity of if I want to hire internationally. And I think it's important just to say to those budding entrepreneurs out there, or those folks that have a project that you're considering maybe shepherding into what would be a business, it's okay to start with people that you know are proven, whether they are proven because they are an expert in their particular field or function, or they're proven because you've worked with them before. Because there's a level of foundation that you want to build into your business initially where you know you can go fast. And some of knowing that you can go fast is tapping into people that you've worked with before at other organizations, or maybe they've already been contributing to your open source, or maybe they're seen as an expert in their field, like why we specifically wanted someone like Martin to join Slim. It's okay to have a level of diversity that you know you're going to intentionally grow from your starting point. Your starting point might be a pretty bland garden. And as long as you know that you need more seeds to put in that garden as your organization grows, it's okay. And I think that that's a pressure that needs to be alleviated from some of our early in career founders or early entrepreneurs who are really looking at this as like, wow, these social justice movements are intense and they're overwhelming. It's okay to start from a starting point as long as you weave intention into how you grow.
Indeed. So there's been some commentary here around code of conducts. So Andy Hazen says that he thinks writing down goals, stroke a COC, so that everyone knows what the good starting place is, and it sets expectations for people throughout the whole project and what the project's trying to achieve. And then Monica goes on to say it's a challenge to convince people why a COC is needed. Some people think that they don't need them, and it's trying to frame it in a way, again, that shows the value to the project. So, Jono, I think some people misinterpret COCs as like a rule book, and that isn't really what they're supposed to be for.
I've always found the discussion of COCs to be quite interesting because, first of all, codes of conduct come in many different forms, and I think some people treat them, for those people who are watching who've worked for companies. I don't want to assume that everybody has worked for a tech company or something along those lines. There's often this situation where you all get together and you make a value statement, right? And we spend a lot of time carving these 8 or 10 values out, and then they get framed and put in above the toilet entrance, and nobody looks at them again. And I think some people treat codes of conduct as this checkbox for what you need to do to encourage a healthy, happy, diverse community. My view is that, first of all, a code of conduct has to be a evolving document. And it doesn't just talk about the values and the principles that you hold dear in the community. Like a lot of people, to your point, Martin, will view them as a rule book. These are all the things you can't do. But I think there's actually an opportunity to have the code of conduct talk about what you want to see. You want to see collaborative, kind, empathetic kind of engagement with each other. And, I have to say, I was involved in this, but I was certainly not the only person involved in formulating the Ubuntu Code of Conduct. But one of the things I loved about and continue to love about the Ubuntu Code of Conduct, and anyone can use it for any project, it's under a Creative Commons license, is that it's not just a rule book. It's the kind of method of collaboration that you want to see. So I think that's really important. The other thing as well is you can't stop with a COC. Right? I've said this a bunch of times before at events and whatever else is, antisocial individuals don't read the code of conduct and then stop being antisocial, right? That's the nice way of me saying it. I use saltier language elsewhere, but I don't know if Martin's going to kill me if I say a bad word. It's just that, it's in the same way that you don't read the 38 pages of terms and conditions before you use an Apple product, right? So to me, the code of conduct is, as far as I'm concerned, it's like table stakes. It's baseline what you need to have a happy, healthy community, including those values and those principles. What's really important, I think what really moves the needle in many ways, is the quality of the leadership, is what the community is going to encourage, and also what is going to be tolerated, right? Like if you allow bad behavior to happen, then people they'll push it and push it and push it and try and get away with it. So to me, what really instills the right kind of principles in the community is going to be the actions of the leaders and the actions of influential people in that community who don't necessarily have to be leaders. The most influential people in any human system are often people with no title. They've just got the respect of their peers. So code of conduct is table stakes for me. And then you've got a layer on top of that. If you just put a code of conduct in place and think everything's going to be hunky-dory, I think at some point you'll be sadly mistaken.
Yeah. Now, we're approaching the limit as to where we're going to run this to. So we've got one question that I haven't posed yet, which is from our podcast. This is Eric. So I think we've probably answered some of Eric's points, but for those that we haven't touched on yet, Eric asks this. Many of my colleagues are new to the best practices of community interactions in open source. What do you recommend to give them as a starting point for community interactions?
Can we plug Jono's book now?
Well, it's funny you should say that. So, here's step one. Let's do that. Jono has written a book recently, which has been extremely well received, I believe, Jono. So it's called People Powered. Now, we're going to do this. The first 10 people that join or are already in the Slim.AI Discord who message me, I'm Wimpy, with the words People Powered, the first 10 that I see, I'll organise with Jono that you get sent a copy of this book. So there's your first starting point. So if you're not in our Discord, the URL is above me. You'll find a link to our Discord in the footer of that page. Come and join. Put the word People Powered in and I'll contact you and get your shipping information and we'll get a book to you. So there's step one. Where do you want to go from there? Any other specifics you'd like to dive into, Jillian?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like this concept of like community. I think it's important to understand what is your leadership voice that you want to have in your community. If you seek to have a leader model, I would highly recommend reading David Marquet's Turn the Ship Around and any of his content that he produces, like Leadership is Language. I really love the underlying philosophy of how he approaches this concept of every single person is a leader and that you need to provide context to each other all the time in order to give control of decision making to everyone within the ecosystem, whether or not it's in a community or it's in a business. And David Marquet is Marquet. I'll make sure Martin shares that with you guys. So understanding what your leadership language is really important because you want the top contributors to be modeling that behavior both in your community and potentially in your business. I think another thing that would be really useful is, just having an understanding of just like basic human communication and what drives human connectivity. And, there are certain things that stick with us forever. Maya Angelou said, people don't remember the words that you say, they remember how you make them feel. So you guys are all going to walk away from this stream today remembering how we made you feel, not necessarily all the words that we said. And so I do think that there's that 80-20 rule of, you remember body language, tone, pace, not words, right? And so weaving that into your community is important because if you have a community where people are only chatting and they're not engaging live in video, then you have even less to go off of to seek to understand where they're coming from.
Very good.
Yeah.
So
I have one quick thing.
Go on then.
One real quick thing I'd recommend. This is super quick. There's so much information out there. I mean, we already just talked about people power. There's so much information out there about how to build communities. It can be really overwhelming. This is what I would recommend. Just go out and experiment. Just go and play. Try something, see what happens, learn from it. Don't try and have all the answers. Even if you get one of the copies of People Power, don't try and build a full strategy and then go out and execute it. Just start experimenting. That's how we all learn. And you'll get much further much quicker.
And I would add to that in terms of interaction in open source communities, if you are about to interact with a new project, take some time to understand the dynamic of that community. If they have a COC, read it. If they have guidelines for code contributions, then get familiar with that and follow it as best as you can. And always assume good intent when you're making contributions to other projects. Even if they say, I'm sorry, you need to refactor this patch in such a way, don't see that as a negative thing. See that as an opportunity to interact with leaders in the project and get to understand their thought processes and involve yourself in their community and the way they want to run things. So assume good intent and get to know the communities that you want to embed yourselves in. So I think that's it for the questions. I'm looking here. There's a few other bits, but no questions as such. So I think what we'll do is we'll start to just put a bow on this now and wrap things up. So thank you both very much. I will be in our Discord after this stream. So if anyone has any follow-on questions following this stream, I will be there to field any questions that you might have. In the meantime, Jono, where can people find you if they want to know more about what it is you do?
Yeah, probably the first place is my website, jonobacon.com, the thoroughly, surprisingly titled name of my website. Very unimaginative. And then the other thing as well is probably social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, the usual kind of places. And I always try to be as much of an open door as possible. So if anyone's got any questions, any thoughts you want to kind of share, jono@jonobacon.org, just drop me an email. And I'm always happy to reply where I can.
Thank you. And Jillian, where can people connect with you?
I tend to spend more time on LinkedIn than Twitter, but I'm on both, so feel free to find me. I think there's only 3 Jillian Hufnagels on LinkedIn, and you'll probably remember which one I am. in addition to that, we at Slim, we're really excited about engaging with users of our SaaS and our open source. So, find us in our Discord, find us in our discourse, and we're really excited to engage with you all. Feedback is gold.
Yeah, indeed. So our Discord and our discourse you can find through the URL above. And yes, we have a SaaS platform. So if you're looking to superpower your Docker and container skills, we do have some seats left on our early access. So if you want to get in and learn some really nice tools for, container lifecycle management and introspection and optimization and security, then join there. And if you've got questions about any of that, then our Discord and our discourse are the place that you can ask your questions, and we will be more than happy to help you. So with that, I think we will say thank you all very much for everyone that came. Thank you for your excellent questions. That was a terrific discussion. And thank you to Jillian and Jono for joining me here on this live stream today.
Thank you. And go and check out Jillian's talk.
Yes, absolutely. Yes,
go
that's
watch it. She's a great speaker.
That's the.
I can't wait to see Monica in person. If the stars align, my flight's already booked, so we will make time for a coffee.
She's great.
Yeah.
She's great, Monica.
Yeah, she is. You will have a lovely time. Monica's a keen tea drinker.
I will drink tea.
Not kidding.
Right. Well, thank you both. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. And we'll see you next week for a continuation of our workshops. And I think Jillian and I are going to be back in about 3 weeks for some more culture and community and team building discussion. So see you next week. And thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.
Friends, thank you.